but she also says, can you hear me? And that is the point that I first want to make is, why are we not listening? Yeah, that would be the first step to take, and then we can think about what we can do. But why are we not even listening? Why is this message not even coming through? And for that is, I find this an important statement. There's a study that just came out. It's actually not fully published. It's still under peer review in the Lancet by Hickman and many other co-authors who surveyed 10,000 young people between the ages of 16 and 25, what we generally now refer to as Gen Z, in 10 different countries. 10 very different countries. And in this chart here, which is additional material to their study, they look at how in that sample different negative emotions are being reported by these young people with regard to climate change. And you see these different emotions listed here. I'm only going to comment on a few here. Yeah, 68% across the board, across the countries, feel afraid because of climate change. 63 feel anxious. 42 experience grief or feel depressed about it. So a lot of negative emotions, as we could imagine. 32% still feel optimistic. Yeah, close to a third. And obviously you can have mixed feelings, right? And very mixed feelings about the issue. Yeah. Some more insights from that study, and I'm obviously not going to go through this whole chart here, but I use it to illustrate, some of the really most recent findings in this area of climate anxiety. Yeah, because again, I'm steering towards the issue: is this really a thing? So what you see in these purple upper bars are the responses to the question whether these negative feelings about climate change already affect function of these young people. Yeah, does it really already have an effect on not just how they feel, but how they go about their day? And we see across all countries, 45% report that is already the case. Yeah, so that the functioning is already somewhat affected. And then we see below that in those more colorful columns, bars here, the responses with regard to how much they already worry about climate change, the red being, worrying a lot, already extremely worried. So we see overall here that there's a lot of worry already present. In the different countries. It's pronounced in different ways, which is also interesting to look into here. The lower one is the United States sample of 1,000 young respondents. And interesting here from my perspective, looking at it, as a researcher interested in the field, is that although my experience in the classroom tells me that there's really a lot of worry already among my young students, in looking at it, comparatively, young people in the United States seem to be comparatively less worried about the whole thing. Yeah, which doesn't really represent what I see, but then again, I teach only here. And so we see that in some other countries, worry about climate change is even more pronounced than here. They were also asked a number of questions with regard to, their thoughts about what is going on and how they feel in general about this whole issue of climate change. Yeah, so 84% say people have failed. That means also they have failed us, the young people. Future is frightening. Humanity is doomed. That's pretty terrible to have to say, right? They feel they have less opportunity than parents, more than half. What they value gets destroyed. The security is threatened. And this is one that leads me to one of my more narrow research field. 41% across the board say that they're hesitant to have children. That's a research interest of mine, trying to figure out, how the worry of climate change or thoughts about climate change in general and our role as humans on the planet affects whether we want to have children or maybe even how many children we want to have, and then how we raise them if we have them. Yeah. So that's a particular area I'm interested in, and it's heartbreaking for me to see how many young people have that worry in mind when they think about having children. Dan, I see your question in the chat with regard to the differences that we may be seeing with regard to United States respondents in the data, and whether that might be a result of media bias, climate change denial. I don't know. I really don't know what the reason is. Also, in the study, they have not investigated it any further. They simply report on the different, different findings that they had. I think there's a couple of things. If I have to speculate, or if I may speculate, there may be a couple of factors at play. Yeah, we come from a position of relative privilege if we're living in this country. Relative privilege, not all of us, certainly not all of us. Yeah, but that may already have an effect, because we also see that in some of the other more privileged countries in the data set, the responses indicate a little less worry. Yeah, it's most pronounced, for instance, in India and some of the countries of in the lower income range. And I'll come back to some more speculation in that area here in a bit. This is the last chart from that study that I would like to highlight, that shows the differences again between the different countries when we look at these different negative thoughts that people have with regard to climate change and also government action, yeah, or those in power who could actually do something. And again, yeah, I point out here those 36% who are hesitant to have children here in the United States sample, and again, that tends to be at the lower end of what's going on in the data overall here in terms of worries that are present. So my one conclusion here, mid conclusion, yeah, is climate anxiety really is a thing. Yeah, it's just looking at that study. I see also it's apparently a thing across the board. Yeah, 10 nations here have been analyzed. So it's a thing. So next thing we need to determine then, how much of a thing is it, and why are there these differences? And here's one more aspect of speculation. This is an article that was just appearing in the Scientific American and reported on very, very recently. Yeah, climate anxiety is an overwhelmingly white phenomenon. And it points to the issue that we all usually assume to be true, that there are connections between different, very complex things that go wrong in our society. Yeah, and that social inequities are at play here as well. It's actually a really, really interesting perspective. I'm not sure I fully share it, but I invite you to read the article. I can also send it later to look into this phenomenon a little bit more, because our perspective on climate anxiety from a research perspective is mostly focused on what in psychology is often called the weird populations. Yeah, so sample populations from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies. They are overrepresented in research that has been published in many different fields of psychology and beyond. Yeah, so this is not specific to this particular topic. But we also need to recognize that these weird people, which I am one of them, yeah, they are not necessarily representative for what's going on in the world. They're not representative for many populations in the world that are already now much more affected by climate change than we are. So that's just one aspect that I think should be kept in mind when we look at research findings with regard to any psychological phenomenon, yeah, and certainly also in this area of climate change. So I think we need a lot more discussion about how the different issues society is grappling with intersect here in this topic of climate change. And I promised I'm coming back to the title of the talk. Yeah, so Greta Thunberg also has said, I want you to act as if the house is on fire, because it is. And she was asking us to, can you hear me? Can you get it? Why are you not getting it? Tell me why you're not getting it. And so I saw that picture, and then I thought about, okay, what are possible explanations why we don't get it, or why do we not listen? If you don't listen, why do we not act, and so forth. And so that's why I talk a little bit about prehistory. So I'm taking you on a journey here into, archaic responses that humans have developed in response to what went on in our environments for thousands of years before we came to where we are today. Okay, so what are the origins of our psychological reaction patterns? Okay, imagine this. Yeah, you're in this scenario. Yeah, you are a very vulnerable human being in prehistoric times, and you're sitting here, and this giant, I assume it's a bear, comes running toward you. If you could imagine that situation, which I hope none of you have ever been in, but if you have, please share what you did. So what do you do? Real question. Does anybody want to tell me what you would do?
Benjamin's got his hand up.
Hi. I think anytime a wild animal approaches, at least like a wild cat, you're supposed to make lots of noises and just stand up to it and encourage it not to get any nearer.
Okay. And I love also the response in the chat, run faster than the other people. Yeah, of course. That's what we do when we meet a bear, right? That's often what, I mean, it's not necessarily what rangers tell us, yeah. But you have some ideas of what you would be doing. Yeah? And in general, in that situation, people respond either with trying to, stand up to the creature. That's a pretty big bear, so good luck with that. But, fight or flight. Run as fast as you can, run faster than the other people if you can, right? So those are our typical psychological reaction patterns to what we call hyperacute emergencies, right? Or a very extreme situation where you can't think about an hour what you're going to be doing. Yeah, you just got to act. And we are actually surprisingly good at that. Yeah, so we have learned in our evolutionary history how to react to this particular frightening event. Yeah, so we call that, of course, the fight or flight response. And sometimes, as you may also have heard and know, we get stuck in between the two, and then we freeze. And sometimes freeze is also the appropriate response. Yeah, hiding in place. Maybe that bear, is not going to do anything if the bear thinks I'm dead, I'm not there, freeze. So freeze could also be a good one. Fight, flight, or freeze. So we're pretty familiar with that. Now here's a slightly different scenario. Again, imagine you've been living in this arid environment for a long time with your little group of family, and there's only one water hole in the vicinity where you need to get all your water. And it gets drier and drier and drier. Yeah, so the environment is changing, and there's more and more predators by that water hole. Yeah, and so every time you want to get water, you put yourself at risk, and you need to figure out what to do in that kind of a scenario. Because you can wait, but you really need the water. There's more and more predators. There's nothing really you can do about it. So this is like latent danger. That's not such a hyperacute scenario, but it develops over time, and you have some time to think about what you're going to do in this context. Yeah. So and these kind of scenarios, and we've had to cope with many times in human history, right? So we also kind of know what to do in that kind of a scenario. Yeah, we again might try to fight off all these predators, or eventually we probably need to move. We got to go somewhere else because there's just so many of these predators. Yeah. And they're not going to go anywhere else, so we got to go somewhere else if we want to survive. And there's another interesting perspective on this. If we as humans, again, we've been sitting around our campfires here for a long time and felt relatively secure, as long as nobody shouts wolf. If you're really noisy, you're going to attract predators. If you're if you shout too early, yeah, those, in this case hyenas, or those wolves will be alerted to your presence, and they will come running. So we have to figure out also how to deal with those people who shout danger and cry wolf too early, too often, in a very annoying manner. Yeah, and we call them alarmists, right? And also in the context of climate change, we have called them alarmists for a while, and that is also a bit of what was happening in the past when we felt we don't need that information. Somebody is actually shouting out something that's not going to be helpful for us. So even this kind of a perspective is somewhat aligned with this sort of evolutionary perspective on what's going on with climate change. And we see some other connections as well. Yeah, we know, of course, for anybody of you who really likes to eat sugary sweets and stuff like me, unfortunately, not good. I know it's not good for me. It was very appropriate in very formal times to eat a lot of sugar when you could get it, right? So you needed to eat a lot whenever you could get it because food was very sparse, and particularly energy-rich food was very sparse. So whenever you got it, you could eat it, and you did, and then, for a while you wouldn't have access to it. Yeah, today we can't follow that strategy, but we still do, right? We eat what we shouldn't eat. We eat way too much, and we don't get rid of that stuff anymore. So again, there's a linkage here. It's inappropriate actually kind of to respond today with the same kind of behavior. And also, if you look at, for instance, what freezing meant in the past, hiding, yeah, so that the predator wouldn't see us, that's also not an appropriate response today. But we seem to freeze in the face of climate change, when in fact we would have to fight. You really need action. So overall, these simple fight or flight or even freeze mechanisms that were so appropriate in the past don't really work all that well in very complex societies as we have them today. Even, that response to that latent danger, where you have to move to a different water hole and all that, doesn't work anymore, because we are within the confines of our nations, and sometimes even smaller, areas where actually it is reasonable to still be able to move around, but we really have nowhere else to go because there's so many people on the planet. So our response mechanisms don't work all that well. And interestingly, a little earlier, Gladys has mentioned something from her own experience. You were referencing nuclear threats. So often when we look at the literature now that deals with climate anxiety and psychological responses, there is that connection being drawn, that those generations who, particularly while they were being socialized into becoming young adults, responded similarly under the threat of nuclear war, as we see today with climate change. I grew up in Germany, and when we had what we then called the Cold War, it seems like now we have a hot war. It was totally normal for people, young or younger people like me at the time, to believe that I didn't have a future. I thought it doesn't matter whether I'm going to go to university or not, because I wasn't even going to make it out of high school before that nuclear bomb would come down, or that nuclear threat or rocket or whatever it might have been. I was convinced of that, totally convinced that that would happen. Yeah. So we are unfortunately in a somewhat similar situation today, but yet different, because it's now not, hoping that one or two people won't push that button. It is that we all collectively need to change, and there is no button that will just, help us accomplish what we need to accomplish. It is much, much more. So while there is some similarity here in those situations, there's also a big difference in that, inaction, not pressing the button, is not the solution here. Yeah. But some of the aspects of how that works psychological may be similar. So here in summary, so we still respond to these global dangers with basically the same psychological mechanisms that are just sort of like hardwired into us, but that is not necessarily relevant. You mentioned a lot in the chat with regard to, you know, climate change denial and not, you know, getting ready for action. So that is maybe a response to being in this freeze situation, really not knowing what to do. Yeah, so it's not necessarily active denial. It's just forced passivity because we really don't even know how to cope. So these familiar stress responses are, you know, problematic because they kind of don't help. There's even some kind of bizarre observations in that area. Yeah, I mean, you hear about going to Mars. I mean, maybe you can continue humanity there. Now we're going to go to space and leave all our trash up there, and try to reestablish, you know, livable habitats somewhere else after we basically are done here with our planet. So I regard that a little bit also here, as some have also pointed out in the literature. That's a flight mechanism. It's not a very realistic one, but it's a, yeah, of course, Elon Musk, one of them. Yeah, but it's a very privileged way to go about the climate crisis, I guess. So if we think about that, you know, how this climate crisis is present in our mind, yet we are unsure how to deal with it. Psychologically, also maybe, you know, from a practical perspective, but also psychologically. We have to acknowledge that it's very likely that there will be a lot of despair among people. Yeah, that's why when we see, or we think there's little action being taken, then that's very, very difficult for us, and is likely to lead to, yeah, fear, anxiety, distress, and negative, you know, effects on our well-being. So these are, from my perspective at least, some explanations why we react to climate change the way we do in the situation where I call it a pre-traumatic stressor. For me, for instance, climate change is a pre-traumatic stressor because I have not been exposed to flooding or extreme, you know, weather events that destroyed my house and have taken everything that I, you know, cherish and love. That has not happened to me. If that had happened, then there would be different reasons to perceive anxiety, right? And psychological distress and so forth. For me, it's anticipation of loss that makes this difficult for me. So that's why it's a pre-traumatic stressor. And it's hard for people like me, and maybe also some of you, to see and sense that not much is done despite this, you know, dire scenario that some of us see. So I'll just briefly point out some of these mental health effects that are associated with climate change or that are discussed in the literature, and you may then identify whether you also perceive them or maybe not. So that we deal actually with mental health as an adverse outcome of climate change threat is comparatively new topic. Yeah, here is a study from 2014, which was one of the first sort of communications from the American Psychological Association on the topic, and they drew this beautiful chart here that in its core show those physical impacts that climate change already has and will in the future have, probably more. And then looks at how, you know, our human systems and infrastructure will likely be affected, and then goes further to take a look at health. And you see on the right-hand side, you know, community health impacts that might be there, and what some of the factors are that will be detrimental in that area. Yeah. You see the physical health impacts on the top, and then the mental health impacts on the left, and those are the ones that I have mostly been focusing on in my work. Yeah, where, you know, our psychological responses play a lot of an important role. And since that came out, luckily there has been more coverage in research and also in the news with regard to the topic. The newest IPCC report that barely came out specifically references the mental health impacts of climate change as one particularly important issue to address now as all of them. Yeah, but finally we are there, that this is also recognized finally from a perspective of a researcher such as me. If we look at the health effects that climate change or environmental decline in general may have, we sometimes differentiate the somateoretic illnesses that result from the actual changes in the climate, for instance because of heat and so forth, here on the left hand side, and then there are the psychoteoretic illnesses, yeah, and those are the ones that I am focusing on, and often those are a precursor to the physical health impacts, of course. So first one here is ecological anxiety, eco-anxiety, or I now say climate anxiety. Those are very closely related. Yeah, a severe debilitating worry because we feel our environment is uncertain and is changing towards the negative. Yeah. There's also eco-paralysis. That's what is sometimes associated with denial and pushing it all away because we feel we don't have the tools to actually respond and feel totally overwhelmed, yeah, paralyzed. Yeah, so that's also again associated with this whole freeze mechanism that I highlighted a little earlier. Yeah, this is one that has affected me a lot in the last year. This is a picture, of course, of taken when Mount Lemmon, I mean, I'm pointing towards it. Mount Lemmon was burning last year. Yeah, and I felt, I'm a hiker, as Stuart pointed out earlier, and I was so scared and so worried about the changes to the dear natural environment. That's solastalgia. Oh, there's an L missing. I apologize. Solastalgia. Yeah, that is a distress or desolation because we see how our immediate natural environment is maybe slowly, maybe quickly deteriorating. Yeah, and that can also be a severe perception. I really suffer from that. I have to admit. Econostalgia is somewhat similar in that people who have been displaced, for instance, by environmental disasters, and then come home to what is no longer looking as their home because it has entirely changed. Yeah, after flooding, for instance, in Germany we had these terrible flooding events last year. And those affected cities are, I mean, it looked like a war zone. Yeah, so it's nothing like what people were used to before, and that certainly also is associated with negative mental health effects. Finally, the last one I want to mention is ecological grief. That is an emotional response because we anticipate loss, or we have already experienced loss, in that case loss of our natural environment, if that natural environment is very important to us and close to our hearts. Yeah, so it can also be somewhat broader, the grief, for instance, perceived because we know so much about biodiversity loss and loss of species, and that can also lead to grief if we anticipate that, for instance, future generations will no longer experience the same biodiversity that we encountered today. In particular, with regard to this ecological grief, it needs to be noted, and this is a team of authors here, Consolo and Ellis, who have written a lot about ecological grief. And they point out that we are aware, we live in times of extraordinary environmental change and most likely loss, and that it is pretty clear and to be anticipated that many people will experience that loss as very severe, and that will have a tremendous effect on our human psyche and our individual psychological makeup and responses. So I leave you with this statement here also to consider. It is totally normal to experience climate anxiety. Yeah, if you listen to the news, if you think about it, it would be rather strange if you are not somewhat anxious about it and worried. Yeah, I mean, so by no means do any of these psychological responses mean that there is any mental illness involved. No, it's a totally rational response to be worried. And I always have to point that out to my students, because when I experience them as being, worried and disconcerted and just, very anxious, then I need to point that out. Yeah, there's a reason why we respond with anxiety, because it motivates action. Now, again, coming back to what I said earlier, we just have such a difficulty identifying what that action might be and how we personally should be responding in this particular environment. Okay, so what now? So there's also some talk and some literature and research on what's called psychological adaptation to climate change. Yeah, if we can't mitigate it, we need to adapt, right? So psychological adaptation, of course, means what's happening in our psyche, in our mind, when we try to cope with what a changed environmental future will mean for us individually and as a collective. Yeah, so psychological adaptation is what we all need to embark on, and that we also need to facilitate, each of us in our specific roles. Yeah, some of us are able to help people directly because of their profession and their background and their experience. Others need to help themselves, and then we need to figure out collectively what we can do. There's one more side note I'm taking here. This is a very unattractive chart, I realize that, but I just want to make it quite clear. Climate change, as I have now said for a while, impacts the human psyche, right? But the human psyche also affects climate change. Initially, before I started my talk here, we talked a little bit about the background of my research and coming from a perspective of climate change and overconsumption and how consumer behavior drives climate change. And consumer behavior is also an outcome of our own decision making and of our society's attitude and our socialization into consumerism. And so, the human psyche affects climate change, and climate change affects the human psyche, although we talk about this in different levels here. Yeah? So if climate change has an effect on our psychological response, we can look at climate anxiety and how to deal with that. As I said, it's a totally normal response. We have to think about pathological responses when people get seriously ill because of their worries about climate change. And then we can also come back to what I talked about earlier with how we as humans are hardwired to make decisions. So in the first two cases, we are on comparatively safe grounds because if climate anxiety is a normal response to what's going on in our environment, then we can also use the tool set that is already available to us from psychiatry, from psychology, to help people in distress, in anxious states. Yeah, a lot of that has to do with self-care and self-compassion and understanding that it's normal to have these kind of feelings. It has a lot to do with sharing experiences with others and being able to talk about that and so forth, right? There are pathological responses and our therapeutic measures that we have for different kinds of anxieties and pathological responses, depression and so forth, may also apply here, with the caveat that we cannot really take away the stressor itself. Climate change is here to stay. Yeah, so that stressor is, we can't remove it. We have to deal with it. We cannot remove it right now. The last two here are the riddle we all need to still solve. Yeah, I talked about these limitations that we have due to our prehistory and our ingrained ways of trying to deal with crises, and the way we as humans process information and come to collective decision making has been explored a lot, for instance, in behavioral economics. Maybe we can learn a little bit from that. But there's a lot more to find out and to research to try and figure out what we can do so that our archaic mind does not hamper our ability to come to solutions that help us out of this misery. So lastly, what now? Yeah, what to do? Just now, there was an interesting article in the New York Times. Climate change finally enters the therapy room, because no longer are people who express, anxiety, ecological anxiety, and so forth, branded as those environmental weirdos, those anxious environmentalist, alarmist, or whatever. That's done. That is seriously done, and we can now, with thoughtfulness, address the issue. So it's also an interesting article. The latest edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5, has just introduced a new diagnosis that has been discussed in the industry for quite a while. It's called prolonged grief disorder. Prolonged grief, as I understand, is grief that's experienced as extremely severe for more than 1 year. Well, our natural environment is probably going to be affected for a longer time than that. So it would be, again, normal to experience grief a longer time than just 1 year. But we see, and what I try to say with that is that, we step up now to better understand and the phenomenon, and also that it will hopefully enable us to treat it better, at least on the individual level. The American Psychological Association has also recently published this new guidance, Mental Health and Our Changing Climate, a whole book providing insight on the matter. Just came out last year. So there's a lot moving. In that particular guidance, there is some instruction for people working in the field of psychology and psychiatry, in how professionals in mental health care can, get ready and address and get prepared for what may be an influx of patients who report on climate anxiety. And so they give, insight on steps to take for that area. I think what is really important in that area is that we need to be able to reframe the dialogue that we're having about climate change, moving away from this problem-centered doomsday kind of messaging to get to a space where it's more solution-centered for each individual of us, but also in the whole climate change debate, climate change mitigation and adaptation debate. What we as individuals can do if we feel like, climate anxiety is really wearing us out and becoming an issue, has also been addressed in some, guidance and materials that may be helpful. I present here a list that has been developed already a couple of years ago by the Australian Psychological Society, which I found quite interesting. It's more really associated with, what you as an individual can do if you feel it gets too much. It gets too much for me sometimes as a researcher and educator that deals with climate change in my work. And so I appreciate that we need that kind of guidance. Finally, what we should do. I started out with a perspective on young people, and my work is focused on the experiences of younger people. I recognize climate change is certainly a collective experience for the whole planet, and climate anxiety is too. I initially talked about this one study that has compared the 10 different countries and the young people's responses. One other important factor that came out there was that nearly 50% of respondents worldwide said that they, in their climate anxiety and in their worries, they are not taken seriously. Their parents, their environment, their teachers, whoever, certainly not their governments, do not take their concerns seriously enough. They don't do anything about it. And they disvalidate, if you will, what the experience of young people are. And that's something that definitely needs to be addressed by a better discourse to have, and by being able to talk about this and find solutions together. And I'm talking about, climate change anxiety. Obviously, we need similar solutions for climate change itself, but I focus on climate anxiety here. So children and young people's feelings and thoughts need to be respected and validated. I find that very important. And their concerns, of course, need to be acted upon by those who are in power. And that can even be their parents, that can be their teachers, educators, that can and are always the governments. So lots to do. That's it on my side, and I appreciate any comments, questions you have. I know there's a lot going on in the chat. I could not respond quickly enough because I can't read and talk.
Thank you, Sabrina. Stephen had a question right at the end. Perhaps you could start with this one, and then we can go to Kurt and Barb. Will we use climate stress as a spur to action, or as a mitigation that will exacerbate our inaction? I'm not quite sure I understand the second part there. Stephen, do you want to rephrase that? Will we use climate stress as a spur to action?
Will we use treatment of climate stress anxiety as a spur to action, or will we just treat it in ways that will mitigate the anxiety and then will exacerbate our inaction?
Got it. Okay. So really, will therapy end up making people feel so much more relaxed they won't do anything? What do you say, Sabrina?
Well, I mean, I am personally convinced that professionals in the field recognize this potential danger, and I would be very surprised if there are now therapies being used that would basically put people to sleep instead of calling for action. But that requires also the ability of the professional to outline what that action can be. Yeah, and then again, if you try to actually address the stressor itself, climate change as the stressor itself, then that would require becoming a more sustainable person, or considering sustainability in your own actions and so forth, so that people would have the perspective, yeah, I am doing something. From action can come hope, from hope can become action. Yeah. If we talk about the element of anxiety itself and how to overcome that, from how I understand it, and remember, I am neither a psychologist nor a psychiatrist. The therapies that we have in place in order to effectively deal with anxiety and reduce anxiety can work in this area as well. I'm not sure about anxiety suppression. I mean, again, is it pathological, or is it a rational, normal response? Yeah, that we feel worried or anxious. It's a whole continuum. Yeah, and not all of that needs treatment in the sense of intervention. A lot of it is just totally normal. And as I said earlier, if we felt no worry and no anxiety, that would be the surprising element.
Sabrina, Barb's got her hand up. Barb, go ahead, and if you could put your hand down also.
Yes. Well, I have to say, being honest with everybody, that I have entered therapy myself for this very reason. I'm doing it now. And I think what is more disconcerting for me is that after COVID and realizing that we could not unify as a nation to defeat COVID because of misinformation and, the whole thing. So then when I'm driving down the road and I see a sign on a car that says, F your Prius. And then I saw a bumper sticker that said, I'm using the gas that you're saving in your EV. It's like, it'd be different to feel like humanity is collectively working to do something about this existential and the greatest crisis we're facing. And I have to say, I'm a person of faith, and ultimately I do believe in God as the beginning and the end. It's my solace and my source of support. But then I lose faith in humanity, because of the how easily people are led astray. I think that's what's hardest for me to accept. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's not that I can't, I'm doing what I can. My involvement in Sustainable Tucson is a big part of that. I'm connecting with people who feel like I do and who want to solve the crisis. But then you see other people who are just so thoughtless and easily led astray and believe or in denial. And that's what I have a hard time with. How do you address that, Sabrina?
Well, I'm not sure I can actively address it, but I have my own thoughts about that, and there are probably several. So one thing is, I'm coming from a different country, and I have lived most of my life in a different country, and so being here, I find the way society works here quite unique and interesting, to put it positively. And then there's many ways in which I would hope that expressions of freedom would work differently, and differently than in consumerism. But on the other hand, it's exactly the spot where you need to be if you want to change something. And I said earlier, a lot of this discussion is driven by the weird people. Particularly the United States, if you look at the research activity, for instance, and if you look at a lot of the climate change reporting, and if you look at the majority of the reporting on climate change denial, that is all centered on the United States for a variety of reasons. We have a particularly unique political environment, particularly a couple of years back. So but that's not the globe. That is not what's happening worldwide. If we were to infer that every country would act like the United States right now, I would be even more worried. But that is not the case. But we tend to see the world as if everybody is like we are. Of course, not all of us do that, but I'm certainly prone to do that sometimes. And I feel like, I'm sitting in my own echo chamber here and make assumptions about what other people's life might look like. And then you travel to another country and recognize it's not the case. And then you talk to people that you meet on the street or elsewhere, and you recognize it's not the case.
Okay, so it's, what you're saying is then it still is possible to flee to another country where maybe you would find more like-minded people and less people that have guns and want to overthrow the government because they're trying to tell their kids what to do and how to think. I mean, there you go, Kurt. There's a rationale for fleeing to another country. I think I might consider it.
There is a rationale for that, but I don't necessarily think you have to go that far. And also I would, from my personal perspective, I would not recommend it because we need to take care of our children, our young generation here.
Wow. Thank you, Sabrina. Thank you, Barb, for raising that. Really, that's a painful question. And I know you're not the only one who's facing that. Trace, and then Danye, and don't forget to put your hand down after you've spoken with Sabrina.
Sabrina, several of us are working on a project called Building Resilience by Building Community. And I'm wondering, one of the things I'm finding, and I think several of us have found, is it seems to be difficult to get people to just take action. Part of that is undoubtedly just time. But I'm wondering if the apprehension that a lot of people are probably feeling could itself be a barrier to taking action. And do you have any thoughts on sort of general approaches we might use to get people engaged and active?
There's an interesting theory which is called terror management theory. Like terror in the sense of, crisis, something terrible, terrorists. So terror, I know my pronunciation of the word is sometimes misleading, terror management. And partly it says that if we are confronted with the notion of our own death, we respond often by pushing that away, right? But we may also respond by what we call proximal defenses, saying we validate our own being, and could do that, for instance, by showing how important we are. And unfortunately, we can also show that by our status and our consumption. So by participating in what is perceived as our own culture and the way in which we establish status in that culture, that helps us in alleviating thoughts of death. Now, I saw in one of the comments in the chat that we often respond to imminent crisis by retail therapy, shopping more, buying more, consuming more, and that's actually something that we observe. Yeah, and on the other hand, because you said there's people who may even recognize that this is such a looming large issue and it's so worrying that they feel terrified and don't want to actually participate because they don't want to expose themselves even more to these sad and maybe anxiety inspiring thoughts. There is a theory that would actually explain that. This is what I'm trying to get at here in a long-winded manner. Of course, it's also resources that are lacking, but to be quite honest, most of us, and I am happy to include myself, are so complacent. It's hard to really get us out of the house for any kind of reason. We feel so busy, and we are not necessarily good at prioritizing. And if we need to prioritize something that's also scary and deal with that, maybe on an everyday basis, I am sure some of the hesitation comes from that. Yeah, but it's also a lot of it is just simply convenience. I see that my students, I mean, they're also terrified and whatnot, but when I then ask them, okay, you can do something, yeah, you can, for instance, join Sustainable Tucson, or you can, work in your community, you can work on your industry, you can work in the university. We have so many sustainability groups that are working effectively. You could do that. Channel your anxiety towards something meaningful and active that's going to help you also in your psyche. Very, very few of them do it because they live their life, and how they have shaped their lifestyle has built barriers. Yeah, the way we have been socialized and how we act as a student, act as a employee, and so forth, really stand in the way of radically changing our lifestyle. And that lifestyle includes not just what we buy and how we live and all that. That's also how we spend our time, and for what causes we invest our time. So I'm sure complacency, convenience, time, and also some element of anticipated fear and worry may explain what's going on.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sabrina. Anxiety is itself aversive, and one of the ways of not having that aversive experience is not pay attention to the thing which makes you feel anxious. So that's one way denial can come up. And what you're saying is if we can get over that initial aversion and just get active, doing something about it, then that burns the anxiety out and you actually feel better. But it requires, you're suggesting, some kind of expectation, perhaps the way you grew up, habits of mind, habits of engagement that would make you more likely to choose an active response versus drowning yourself in beer, clothing, or lattes. Tanya, did you want to ask a question?
Yes. And I have just some thoughts to share too. Forgive me if I repeat something, but I was just thinking, like, what you just said, Stuart, it's kind of like the same as with starting an exercise routine. Like, people tend to feel so overwhelmed at the beginning, right? But if they just do it and they start to feel better, then they keep doing it. I'm just seeing like a similarity there. Like, it's uncomfortable to start something new. And I think we all have trouble starting new things in general. I don't know if it's, I'm an adult education instructor, and I teach climate change in my classes, and I just presented today at the National Adult Ed Conference on the topic of teaching climate change, and I really I'm working to try to get that more incorporated into adult ed classes. And if you're willing to share any slides or materials, I would love that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
And I just had so many thoughts about several things, but like I'm wondering if you think there's less anxiety among BIPOC people, like primarily because of hierarchy of needs. There's just like more kind of immediately pressing. I'm wondering how much of a factor you think that is.
I gave a guest lecture last year. Oh, Zoom enables everything, right? For students in a master program of psychology in Pakistan. And they live in the Peshawar region, which is very close to Afghanistan and a lot of turmoil. And I talked to them about, climate anxiety and these things. And they were surprisingly, and here I am, yeah, weird, surprisingly educated about the notion. But why would I even think that that's surprising, right? I mean, they live in an environment that is particularly affected by climate change already, yeah. And I spoke with them, and then after a while I was like, what are your thoughts in terms of climate anxiety, and how is it affecting you? I mean, they're psychologists, right? Or they're going to be psychologists, so they have to deal with these kind of issues and many others. And it was really insightful, because they said, well, we are worried about it, we recognize it, but prioritizing what to be worried about, the proximity to Afghanistan and what's going on there really overrules our current climate anxiety. But I mean, just imagine how horrible that is, because you have all these issues, and they are compounding. It's not like one supersedes the other, so I can put one to the side. They're all there, just in different layers. And I thought that was very thought-provoking for me. Yeah, so we make assumptions about what may be going on in other people's minds, but their circumstances may be so different.
Did you learn anything, Sabrina, from those students about how they do cope?
As I said, most of them are female. It is very difficult to speak with them in the first place. In a patriarchal society, they were all Muslim. You really had to coax that out. Plus, I mean, they understood English, but their language, I couldn't really understand all that well. So it's just limiting what I could explore there. But they seem to be of the opinion that being ingrained in your family, they talk more about family than community, was the key for them. Yeah, because they maybe much more so than we do live in a family, in intergenerational homes, and that seemed to give them solace.
Community.
Yeah,
community is a big part. Well, Stephen,
I have kind of a weird question.
A weird question, okay.
Yeah, not weird as you talked about, but actually strange, I guess. I've done a lot of animal behavior study, and I'm particularly interested in ants and how the chemical signals work. And I'm wondering, in an age where humanity is becoming more and more communal, more and more interactive with itself, if climate stressors are operating our actions more than we think, in concert with a lot of other stressors, authoritarianism and poverty, inequity, and all the other things that we all now are so much more communicative with. Is it possible then that the solution could come the same way, that we'll transmit signals to each other about actions that will solve these things?
Well, I think the information about what we need to do is there. It's not like we need to present it with, what needs to happen in order to reduce carbon in our environment. We know what needs to be done. We individually don't know how to incorporate that into our lifestyle. And we individually may not be willing to, accept governmental action, for instance, that would require us to drastically limit our carbon impact. But I mean, those are the solutions that we need. So I'm not, maybe in the sense that there's still plenty of people out there who deny climate change or think it's not a big issue. But as I said earlier, those are probably not all that many people. Yeah, so the majority of the ants are convinced. Yeah, and no, maybe it just doesn't necessarily transfer to individual action. And I'm not entirely sure about the premise that we get more community oriented. Compared to what I was talking about earlier, prehistory, I would suggest we probably are less community oriented today, particularly here, than we were in our prehistoric past.
Thanks.
Sabrina, it feels like excuse me, we're not at the end, but it feels like we're sort of on the last round or getting near there. And I wonder whether it might be fun to just ask everyone to put into the chat box what we are each doing to cope and or to act. Action is a form of coping. You were saying that hope can beget action and action can beget hope, or was that someone else who said that? Maybe that was Barbara. But what if we actually just entered everyone into the chat box what we're doing? Could we take a minute with that, Sabrina?
Sure, yeah, of course, it's your time.
Well, it's our shared time. So let's all just type into the chat box, what are you doing about climate change? And if you feel you're not doing very much, you can also put in, well, here's what more I want to do.
Just for clarification, what we do in terms of addressing our climate change anxiety, or what we do in terms of, sort of like mitigating climate change, our carbon footprint?
Well, they're quite intimately connected. If we weren't anxious about climate, we probably wouldn't be doing anything. What would you like to suggest?
I would suggest to stick with the climate anxiety piece first,
Okay.
because I think the responses to the second are maybe easier.
Okay. So what are we doing to deal with anxiety? We can all enter to send to everyone. Okay. Sabrina, would you like to comment on any of those?
Well, it's quite across the board, right? I mean, I'm just trying to, catch up with a couple of them.
Yeah.
personally wouldn't necessarily prescribe to the heavy drinking in that stage, but if it helps some. Yeah, a lot of it again has to do with, you know, sharing experiences and activity in community, and yeah, and supporting communities with our work, and that gives us inspiration as well as hope. Yeah, I see on a more serious note, yeah, I feel frustrated and angry too, and how could you not? Again, yeah, I think it's important to you know, sort of like recognize that those are totally normal feelings. It's obviously a matter of how we work on those and how we respond to those, and in a more, you know, proactive and positive manner, or whether that just, you know, wears us down or actually, you know, creates an environment, a social environment around us that's more problematic. I wrote, you know, I try to enjoy nature, particularly with my child, and I try to, as much as I don't know I can actually achieve that, but instill values in him that I think are important and that will help him cope as well. And I think that a profound appreciation for nature that comes with exposure to the natural environment and to animals and all that will be very helpful. We have seen in, you know, one of the studies, and that Stuart probably read, and that, you know, at the end of the day brought me here. We found in a study that people who share environmental values and, you know, manage coping strategies in a different manner than those people who are not so much aligned with nature, or don't think that that's a priority in their life, or that it's such a valuable thing to have. Yeah, so that in and of itself makes a big difference. And I personally am a strong believer that environmental education, starting in preschool, is extremely important in this context. And that's also something, I guess, where all of us can help, because education is not necessarily structured education, as much as I appreciate that, but it's also, you know, education by parents, by grandparents, by friends, family, and so forth. And I just think that's key.
Thank you, everyone, for this. Very inspiring. I hope that on Trace it's possible to copy those things. It's a nice little uplift to see what people are doing. Danya, did you have a last question?
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. I just wanted to ask you, Sabrina, if what you think about thoughts I've been having recently. I think that you know, knowing a little bit about our psychology. I have some psychology background, not nearly as much as you, but just it feels like we just need to like lighten it just enough so that we can get engaged, you know, like awareness campaigns combined with motivational strategies, like people need to feel like they're having fun, and it needs to become like something they can join in, and like those are strategies, right, to mitigate the overwhelm. And then also like just creating more support networks, you know, so that just people have support for making changes. And yeah, and it's a really general feeling and not much strategy to it yet, but just wanted to hear your perspective on that.
I think that's a profound observation, because a lot of our messaging around climate change, particularly, you know, in the news and so forth, is all about devastation. Yeah, and it's a very normal response for a human being to not try and associate themselves with devastation all around them. Yeah, and that doesn't mean dismissal or denial or anything like that, but we simply are not able to continuously deal with negative news. It just doesn't work that way. Yeah, and I think we are starting to see that the messaging around climate change if we go away from the media that looks for like disaster and newsworthy stuff, that messaging is becoming more thoughtful and much more systematically engaging, and recognizing that you can't just throw the trash can over people. You have to tell them how to dig out and what to do. And if they know, or if they hear what they can do, many will feel inspired and actually do something about it. And then we come to this hope action kind of circle. I put in the chat the word regeneration. I was last week at the Higher Education Climate Leadership Summit, which is a conference on higher education and dealing with this whole climate change stuff. And they showed a documentary which is pre-announced there. It's called 2040, and that took this regenerative perspective on everything. Yes, we have to understand that we are in a profound crisis. Yeah, we are. So, okay, done. So where do we go from here? And how do we help, particularly the young people, to get back into a situation where their future has an outlook of flourishing, of regenerating? So that's our effort. We need to regenerate. We need to regenerate our environment. We need to regenerate our society. We need to regenerate ourselves. And I thought that was a very, that's a very interesting perspective. And I find it personally very helpful. If I look at my students and don't look at them as, Gen Z. Gen Z is the last to come. It's the letter Z. How stupid is that? Come on. They are the regeneration. They'll get it done.
That's great.
Wow. Yeah, words to celebrate. I wrote those down. And there's an author named Paul Hawkins. Some of you may have heard of him. His first book was called The Ecology of Commerce. And pretty soon he sold his part in his business that was doing quite well, I believe, and began to give talks, and people would, after talk, they'd say, "Hey, that was great, man. I just want you to know about our project we're doing. We're restoring the stream back at the school here." And he'd get a business card, and he'd put all these business cards in a shoebox when he went home. And after a few years of this, he looked at all these business cards and thought, there are a lot of people doing a lot of things here. And so he actually started counting. I guess he got some people to help him counting how many groups like Sustainable Tucson, like Watershed Management Group, like the Sonoran Environmental Research Institute in Southern Tucson. It's over 1 million. And he wrote a book called Blessed Unrest, and talked about we are all having this unrest because of the destruction that's being done to people, to communities, to the natural world. And yeah, it's tough and we don't know how it's going to turn out, but there are a lot of us doing this. And he said, you are the immune cells of the body of the earth, as it were, or of the human community. We are the immune cells. And no one immune cell is going to stop the disease, but the immune cells working as part of a whole system mean a lot. And that could be the meaning when Gandhi said, what you do is insignificant, but it's very important that you do it. I'd like to share with you, for example, if you'd like to engage with other folks, if you're not already engaged with Students for Sustainability or Sustainable Tucson, there are a lot of folks, some of them here today, who are engaged with the organization. There's a lot going on. And maybe you'll hear something that would be fun for you and uplifting. Just this month, we submitted 5 climate policy recommendations to the Mayor's Climate and Sustainability Office. And that was the work of Dwayne, who's here, and Trace, who's here, and several other people, including some of our younger sustainability ambassadors. Last summer, we began advocating against carbon increasing waste management proposals that are being considered very seriously by the Tucson Environmental Services Department. And we may indeed have to work even harder on this one, but that's an issue that we're taking on. There are 5 committees. Jana, who's here, or was, I'm not sure if she's still here.
I'm here.
Yeah, there you are. Jana started the first committee that's now called the Zero Waste Committee. And in addition to that, there's habitat restoration. Barb has been involved with the Charitable and Faith-Based Sustainability Committee, which is helping get green infrastructure and other green profile actions at congregations and nonprofit properties. There's energy transformation, which Dwayne is leading up. And then Trace mentioned the building resilience and building community effort. So any one of those could be engaging and uplifting. There was a beautiful quote, Sabrina, you had on one of your latter slides. We all, and particularly young children and young people, would benefit from having an improved social discourse. Sort of the ecology of our society has also been polluted by a lot of negativity in the discourse. And our ambassadors training helps on that. We also did a separate series called Leadership Training. We'll do that again in the fall, talking about things like empathy, inquiry, problem solving, or maybe better solution finding, as you're suggesting, Sabrina. And check out our newsletter if you're not on the mailing list. Just write to Paula at sustainabletucson.org and she'll get you on, because there's some really wonderful opportunities and we'd love to have everyone engaged in one or more of those things.
And Stuart, that's a good segue to reminding people, as I did earlier, that we are going to be tabling down at the Earth Day event at Children's Museum and Armory Park on the 23rd, Saturday. And we could use some volunteers for that, somewhere between 9 and 1. And then the next day we'll be at Heirloom Farmers Market at Rieta Racetrack between 8 and 12. And you can contact me if you're able to help out with either of those. Lots of fun activities and really great opportunities for conversation, getting people engaged in the sustainability issues and hearing what they have to say about all of these things that are going on in our world. I'd like to remind you all to fill out the survey that you would have gotten in an email from us last week as we move into doing some really exciting planning for the future of the organization. And save the date, May 10th. That'll be our next Sustainable Tucson monthly meeting. And it's going to be about straw bale construction, then, now, and whenever. So it should be a lot of fun. We've got Joe Sillins, David Eisenberg, and Matt Smearman talking about different aspects of the revival of use of straw bale construction.
Are you taking other announcements as well, Paula?
Sure.
Yeah, so if anybody also wants any calls to action on environmental issues, you can email me it's Janice at sustainabletucson.com and get on our email list for calls to action. The most recent one is there's going to be a rally against the Rosemont mine on Friday from 4 to 5:30. I can go grab that, the address, but it's essentially downtown. Let me go grab the address really fast.
Anna, did you mean sustainabletucson.org?
Oh, is it .org? Sorry, yeah, I was trying to remember it was .org. I was about to send that off and I wouldn't know if it was .com or .org. There it is.
Dana, would you mind putting that contact information in the chat in case people want to just copy it?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, it's there now. I'm sorry.
Okay, I want to grab really fast. Let me find the address of where, if anybody wants to go to the rally on Friday, but I need to open my page. Not opening fast. I should have looked this up before, sorry.
Jana, while you're doing that, I'll just
Sure.
say again, Sabrina, this was a remarkable amount of information you shared, and understandable as well, which is always an accomplishment in itself. The idea of the different forms of emotional response, looking at the surveys of young people, 10,000 young people around the world, and even the concept of the weird bias in some of the information gathering, your willingness to give your opinions and also to say where you don't know. These are all models of a careful and caring scholar. Would you like to give us a last comment, a sort of benediction on this evening for us?
Well, first of all, I truly appreciate those very kind words. I hope that there's some element in what I talked about that resonates. I would be very, very glad if there's like one little thing in there that you can have work in your mind a little bit more. If there's any additional questions, suggestions, or concerns about what I said, please get in touch. As I said earlier, my research focuses on the younger generation, and in this last moment here, my last paragraph, sort of like I said something about the Generation Z being the last one, right? They're of course the first ones. Mm-hmm. They're the first ones who leave behind an unsustainable lifestyle and embark onto a new journey that's going to be better, and that's going to lead to a healthier and better future. So they're the first ones. So we're not leaving them behind. We are maybe pushing them out there. Maybe if we can help, we're going to push them out there. We're going to give them all our energy and all our help that we can. And they will succeed. There's no doubt about it. They will.
Thank you, Dr. Helm.
Thank you all very much for having me. It was a great pleasure. Anytime again, and please contact me. My email address was in the slides. I'm going to share the slides with Stuart. If anybody's interested, use them however you wish.